Hi, welcome to the video JPA EntityManager Persist versus Merge. I am Nam Haming from Code.Java.net. In this video, I lab to help you understand the semantics of the persist and merge operations of an entity manager as defined by the Java Persistence API or JPA. In details, I'll show you some code examples with Spring Boot and Spring Data JPA, so you will understand the differences between persist and merge, and you also know when to use the persist and merge operation in the application. Alright, so I have a Java Maven project for a Spring Boot application in a Spring Tools with IDE. You see, in this project I have a repository class here that you see is an entity manager. You see, and I use the persist method in the save method here to save a new contact object into the database, and I use the merge method of the entity manager to update an existing contact in the database. And in the next few minutes, you will understand why I use persist here, why I use merge here, and the differences. Now let's understand the semantics of the entity manager's persist method. You know, the JPA specification defines the persist method in the entity manager interface like this. Void persist object entity is the method parameter. Make an entity instance managed and persistent. The entity object is an object of a class that is mapped to a table in the database. And after the method executed successfully, a new row inserted into the corresponding table in the database, and the entity object becomes a managed or persistent object, and the entity manager tracks changes of persistent objects. So note that any changes to the entity object in the passed into the method here will be synced with database, provided that the changes happen within the transaction boundary. Okay, now let me write some code to help you understand the semantics of the persist operation. So come back to the project. In this project, I have the main class, which is a Spring Boot application. You see, it is a console application. It implements the command line runner interface. And let me delete the unrelated code in this class. I keep only the related code. Delete the list context method. Add contact. Delete contact. I keep only the method for the create and update operations. Okay, and in the contact or repository interface here, the save method and the update method are very simple, you see. Okay, and let me test the create contact method first. Create contact. You see, the code in the create contact is trying to persist a new contact object. It sets the details for the contact object here and calls the save method of the repository class, which uses the persist method of the entity manager interface. Okay, and in this project I have an entity class, the contact class, that is mapped to the contacts table in the database. You see, it has 4 fields: ID, name, email, and address. Very simple. And in the database in MySQL Workbench, in the contacts table, you see currently it is empty, no rows. Okay, and to help you understand the semantics of the persist operation, I will add some additional code here into the save method here. the entity manager interface provides the method contains that checks for the a given object is managed or not. Managed. Okay, and before calling the persist operation, I print out something to the standard output here. Before persist managed. Okay, and I do similar after the persist operation. After persist managed, here you see to see the state of the contact object before and after the persist operation. Okay, now I run the program, run as Java application. Okay, you see it executed the SQL insert statement into the context table, and you can see before that it prints before persist managed false, and after persist managed false. Oh, let me check. Sorry, I need to call again. Set the value again. Okay, after the persist operation. Now I think a new row inserted into the database. Yeah. Okay, no problem. Let me run the code again. Change the name here. Nam Minh. Nam add code java.net address Vietnam. Okay, and I also add a new line here to bring the ID of the contact object here. Contact ID before persist contact get ID, and bring the contact after calling the same method of the repository class. Contact ID after persist, after save, before save. Okay, and run the program again. Okay, you see it prints contact ID before save now. Before persist managed false, and it executed the insert SQL statement, and it prints after persist managed true. You see, after the persist operation, the object contact is managed by the entity manager. Here you see, after persist managed true here, and the contact ID after save is equal to 2. Yeah. Okay, let me check the database. We have the second row inserted into the contacts table with the ID 2 here. Okay, so far so good. So that's the semantic, a new row inserted into the corresponding table, and the entity object becomes a managed or persistent object. Now let me update, write another code to help you understand the semantic, saying that the entity manager tracks changes of the persistent objects, and any changes to the entity object will be synced with the database. Okay, let me update the code in the save method here. You see, after calling persist operation here, I modify the contact object. For example, I set the address to CA USA. Okay, let me change contact details here to another name. John Doe. John. You see, Here I set the arrest is Vietnam. And in the save method, after the persist operation, I set the arrest again to CA USA. That means the contact object is modified after the persist operation. But after the persist operation, the contact object is a persistent object. Okay, now let me run the program again. Okay, successful. Now you see it executed two SQL statements. The first one is insert into context table, and the second one is update context. The second SQL statement, the update statement is the result of the statement context set arrest here because the entity manager checks changes of the contact object here after the persist operation. So any changes to the contact object got synced with the database. Now let me check in my SQL Workbench. You see I have the third row inserted with the arrest is CIUSA here. Makes sense. Now, what if I move the statement that modifies the arrest of the contact outside the transaction boundary? Outside this method, I move here after calling the same method of the repository here. Okay, so and now I'll run again. And this time I change the name to another one. Bill Gates, Microsoft.com, and I set arrest to Vietnam. Sorry, arrest to Seattle, USA. And after calling the same method, you see after calling the same method, I set and modify the arrest again to Vietnam, for example. Okay, now run the program again. Now you see it executed only one SQL insert statement, insert into context table. Let me check in the database. We have the fourth row inserted here, Bill Gates, Seattle, USA. So you see that means after the save method here, any changes to the contact object here will not be synchronized with the database is because the changes happen outside the transaction. The transaction the transaction boundary is the code inside the save method here. That means that explains the semantic. Any changes to the entity object will be synchronized with the database, provided that the changes happen within the transaction boundary. Make sense? Okay, and let me try to write some another code to persist a contact object that already has an ID. Here I set ID for the contact object. Set ID, for example, ID 4 here. That means the contact object here is detached object. Okay, now let me try to run the program again. You see, I try to persist to save a contact that has value for ID here. You see, now I got the error detached entity passed to persist contact. That means we cannot use the persist method to save a detached object. Okay, makes sense. Let's understand the entity manager merge method. JPA specification defines the merge method in the entity manager interface like this. It takes an object of type T and returns an object of type T. Merge the state of the given entity into the current persistence context and returns a managed instance that the state was merged to. After the method executed successfully, a row is inserted or the existing row is updated in the database, and the returned object is different than the past object. And if the past object is not managed, it stays unmanaged, and the entity manager tracks changes of the return object within the transaction boundary. Now let me update the code in the project to help you understand the semantics of the merge operation in the entity manager interface. So in this contact repository class, I have the update method here. It simply calls the merge method of the entity manager. Now I want to add some additional code. Here I delete the unused methods here, file and find my ID, and delete to make the code more clean. Okay, cleaner. Okay, and I print before merge here, and print before after merge here. After merge, and I assign the returned object to updated contact and return updated contact here. Okay, and firstly I test update method, update contact. Okay, I delete this and change the method here to update contact. Update contact. Okay. Okay, let me delete some rows in the contacts table here. Delete rows. Apply. Finished. Okay. Update contact ID before, update contact ID after, update. Okay, and run the program. You see it executed the SQL insert statement, and you see it printed contact ID before update null and before merge managed false, and after merge managed false. You see, so it is different than the persist operation. You see contact ID after update null here. That means the contact object passed into the method here stays unmanaged if it is unmanaged. You see it printed before merged managed false and after merged managed false here, and the contact ID after before or after are both now here. You see that means the contact object passed into the merged operation here is not updated. Let me check the database. You see we have the second row inserted here. Okay, perfect. Okay, and I check the updated contact object here. Returned object managed here. Entity manager contains updated contact. Okay, and now I try to merge a detached object. So I set ID for the contact object, contact set ID 5. Okay, and I want to set the name William Bewitz. Okay, and run the program. Now you see it executed the SQL select statement to retrieve an existing object from the database with the given ID 5 here. You see, and you see contact ID before update 5, before merge managed first, after merge managed first, and return object managed true. And then it executed the SQL update statement to merge the name, the details of the contact object, and you see it print contact ID after update 5. So that means the merge operation for the touch object executes two SQL statements. The first one to get the existing row in the database with the given ID, and the second one to update the row in the database. You see, and let me check the database contacts table. You see name updated to William Bewitz. Okay, and let me update the code, modify the contact object, the return object after the merge operation here. I update a few of the updated contact object which is returned from the merge operation here. Okay, so I call updated contact. I set the arrest to CA USA. So you see, after the merge operation, I change the rest of the return object. Okay, now run the program again. Okay, you see it executed two SQL statements. The first one for selecting contact object from the database, and the second one is for updating the contact by ID here. And let me check in my SQL workbench. You see arrest updated to CA USA. That means any changes to the return object within the transaction boundary will be synchronized with the database. Okay, now let me modify the return object outside the transaction. Here, it returns updated contact object, and I modify the rest to Tokyo, Japan. Yeah. Okay, and note that in the database, the current address of this contact is CA USA, contact ID 5. Okay, now run the program again. Okay, now let me check the database. You see, the address is Seattle, USA, which is a value I set before calling the merge operation here. And you see because I modify the return object outside the transaction boundary here. The changes are not synchronized with the database, so that the semantics of the merge operation, you see, a row is inserted or the existing row is updated, the return object is different than the past object. If the past object is not managed, it stays unmanaged, and the entity manager tracks changes of the return object within the transaction boundary. Make sense? Okay, so to summary, for the persist operation, the entity object should be a new or unmanaged instance, whereas with the merge operation, the entity object can be a new or persistent instance, and the entity object cannot be a detached instance in case of the persist operation. And in case of the merge operation, the entity object can be a detached instance. And for the persist operation, the entity object becomes a persistent instance after the operation completed. Whereas with the merge operation, the state of the entity object is not changed after the operation completed, and the persist method returns nothing or void, and the merge method returns the managed instance of type T. So generally, you can use the persist operation to implement the create or add function in the application, and use the merge operation to implement the create and update function in the application. So I have shared with you the differences between persist and merge operations in the entity manager interface as defined by JPA specification. I hope you found this video helpful. Please subscribe to my channel, like, comment, and share this video. Thanks for watching.